Hi everyone, my name is Karen Humphries and I'm with an organization called Continuity SA. I'd like to thank everyone for making time available to participate in today's webcast. The topic of the presentation is the concept of operational resilience as part of organizational resilience. Please bear in mind that if you have any technical difficulties as we go along, with sound or even the slides, to please contact the BCI directly to address those. I'll go through the presentation and then take some questions afterwards. However, I think on the screens there is a question block that you could use at any time during the presentation, where you can then type in your questions. We won't do any verbal questions, only the typed ones. And then if we run out of time afterwards, I will be sharing my contact details with you and we can have an offline conversation and debate on some of the topics. So without any further delay, let's now begin the featured presentation for today. Again, I'm Karen Humphries from Continuity SA, presenting on operational resilience as part of organizational resilience. So from an agenda perspective, we'll begin the presentation by looking at the principle of what is operational resilience. Secondly, we'll focus on how operational resilience features in the bigger picture of the organization. Thirdly, we'll look at the integration with risk management and business continuity. We'll then move on to address the need that organizations have, the challenges that they may face, and then the overall requirements, if you like. And then as a point number 6, we'll focus on an example of a framework or an approach for organizational resilience itself. So at the end, we'll then end off with a closing, and as mentioned before, we'll then address some of the questions that came through as part of the presentation. So what is organizational and operational resilience? So operational resilience is a set of techniques that allow people, processes, and information systems to adapt to any changes or any changing patterns. It's the ability to alter the operations in the face of changing business conditions, and it enables processes to continue operations despite the various disruptions. Now, how does operational resilience then feature in the bigger picture of organizational resilience? Now, according to the British standard called BS 65000, organizational resilience is the ability of an organization to anticipate, to prepare, to respond and to adapt to incremental change and sudden disruptions in order to survive and prosper. Looking at the definition stated by ISO, it states that organizational resilience is the ability of an organization to absorb and to adapt to a changing environment. Then if you look on the right-hand side, the definition of operational resilience is, again, as mentioned before, those set of techniques that allow the people, the processes, the information systems to adapt to changing patterns, and the ability to alter the operations in the face of changing business conditions. And then finally, according to IBM, operational resilience is the ability of an organization's business operations to rapidly adapt and respond to internal and external dynamic change, including opportunities, demands, disruptions or threats, and continue operations with limited impact to the business. Now, what this clearly shows is that operational resilience is a key subset of the bigger picture of organizational resilience. It focuses on processes, on people, on systems, therefore those building blocks and the foundation of any organization. Operational resilience is that key starting point or that essential point to ultimately achieve the overall organizational resilience that we want to achieve. Therefore, in a way, you can't have the one without the other. Now, let's look at the integration of operational resilience with risk management and with business continuity. The principle of risk management enables a world of controls to protect the environment, to identify, to analyze, and to evaluate risks. And those risks, to then monitor and review them constantly, and to anticipate and prevent. And then we have business continuity management that enables the response to major events, to analyze, to design, to implement, to validate, and to embed. Addressing emergency response, crisis management, business continuity, IT continuity. Therefore, that overall principle to respond and to recover. However, this alone is not enough and does not meet all the organization's needs for dealing with disruptive events at an operational level before even triggering the invocation of a business continuity management plan. Operational resilience is the key link between these two worlds as shown in this diagram. The key steps being to assess the operational issues, to identify solutions, to implement those solutions, and to continuously monitor and to respond and report on those. Again, it's clear that organizations require risk management, they require business continuity, but they also require operational resilience to achieve the overall organizational resilience needed. Now, let's discuss therefore the need that organizations then have and what is required. The playing field in which businesses have to operate today have changed. Organizations face complex operating environments. We face cybercrime that's rising each and every day. We face systematic IT failures because of design or procedural problems. We have competitive forces, which are those factors that influence the competitive positions of our companies in an industry or in a market. And those competitive forces being the bargaining power of buyers or suppliers, the threat of new competition, or even the competition amongst existing companies. We have the emerging technologies, the economic upturns, and I think a key one that we see, and that's quite evident, is the legacy IT systems. There's governance challenges, supply chain disruptions, and I think each and every organization do face that rising customer expectations. Yet, as an organization, we still want to ensure that we compete successfully, that we protect our brand and our reputation, that we do want to meet those rising customer expectations. And we want to do all of this within the compliance requirements stated with the specific industry that you're in. Therefore, it's very much this balancing act to address these objectives that we have, but also then addressing the world that we operate in. So let's look at these challenges in a bit more detail and then address some of the requirements as well. So unfortunately, all organizations have traces of building blocks that makes the response to an operational disruption sometimes extremely difficult. These traces are the dynamic landscapes that we are in, the customer expectations that we just spoke about. Sometimes we have leadership constraints or limited tactics or strategies within the organization. We sometimes do see the silo approach from subject matters, ranging from BCM, risk, information security, DR, crisis management, etc. Organizational changes that happen, skill gaps, resource limitations, and maybe a lack of knowledge management. Sometimes a lot of assumptions, inconsistency of technology, inaccessibility of information, cost constraints, or even ineffective controls. And furthermore, sometimes it's required that we respond to operational disruptions, that we require multiple parties, and it can very quickly result in a running around to manage these events. So I'm sure looking at the screen, we all do see glimpses of something that is familiar or that touches on key components that you face on a daily basis in managing operational disruptions. So looking at an example of a framework on what we require is essential. So the key requirement then is for an organization to have a dynamic approach to operational resilience. And then for this approach or framework to include the key dependencies, the governance structures in place and defined and documented, the right people, so that we have this resilient culture ultimately to address operational resilience within our business. Now, let's look at an example of a framework or approach that can be applied. Now, the key thing that we want to achieve is to make sure that the results of our operational framework provide us with, and our management teams, with the following functionalities. Now, firstly, we require, in a way, a compelling at-a-glance visualization of our vulnerabilities within our business. If you like, a landscape view or a bird's eye view that displays the impact levels that we can face, and then that it also highlights those possible points of failures that we may have. Secondly, what we need from an appropriate framework is an informed decision-making capability in terms of how these identified points of failures or vulnerabilities should be managed. And then finally, depending on the level of threats posed and the organization's risk appetite, these vulnerabilities can be integrated into the existing risk management principles within the organization as a mitigating factor. So as an example, let's look at a very high-level 4-step framework or approach, with the first step being that defining the organizational structure, the second one then being conducting the physical analysis, then doing the classification of points of failures and what that exactly means, and then how we as an organization then manage it. Keeping in mind that each and every organization is unique and that the framework should be customized and detailed to suit the environment and the appetite of the business. So the first step then being defining that organizational structure. This then provides us with that holistic view or that bird's eye view of the organization, giving you either that business unit or function or process or even activity view. Now, you can do this on specific value chains or across the business or on specific scope requirements, again, depending on the need and the requirement of the business itself. Secondly, it is to analyze this environment by looking and getting an understanding of these functions and processes. Understanding the operating status, be that dependent on individuals from a manual perspective, systems or technology of the automatic, or even then a bit of both. Then understanding the business as usual processes at a detailed level to enable the analysis of threats and risks. Looking at the critical times to get an understanding of time sensitivities, and then spending a bit of time defining the resource dependencies from a people and skill perspective, a system perspective and technology, work area requirements, documentation and records, equipment, external requirements like services or suppliers external to the organization, and even internal process dependencies. And then finally getting an understanding of the impacts that the organization can face in the event that the process is impacted, be that from a service or product delivery perspective, reputational, compliance, financial, and so forth. The key consideration here is to align these impacts to the risk management principles within the business so that we ensure this integrated approach as part of the implementation. Now, in the event that a process is identified where these possible unacceptable impacts do occur, it's sometimes needed to analyze the process in a bit more detail by looking at the risks or the threats linked to this activity. So from a risk perspective, it's those losses or impacts that we can face as a result of a specific threat that's then highlighted. Then looking at what the possible triggers are, and then the possible cause of these events, as well as the category that they fall in. Again, being that people component, system or technology perspective, a work area, a documentation and record, equipment, supplier or external requirements, or even an internal process issue. If the required contingency plans exist, then finally, to guide us through the response. Now we can then utilize this information, and it's then possible to highlight where our points of failures are. Now, what defines a single point of failure or point of failure is unique to every organization, and it's key to spend a bit of time on defining that definition for each organization, and that then suits the environment. So I've listed here 2 examples. The first one being that it is a component of the impact level that you may face, linked to known threats or risks, and then the lack of contingency planning associated to it, or looking at impact levels, linking it to dependency levels versus redundancy components. So these are 2 examples, but again, it's unique to every organization to define that component definition or formula to calculate what constitutes a single point of failure or point of failure for the organization. This then brings us to the final step where we can then highlight those on the landscape that we've defined, and then feed this information, first of all, into our risk management function, where it can feed into managing and monitoring and allocating ownership to those threat or risks, and then also ensuring that the required contingency or response plans are developed. Now, I'm sure you'll agree that it's not possible to mitigate all points of failures. Therefore, having these response plans are quite crucial. And even if there is mitigation options, it does take some time, usually from an implementation perspective. And in the meantime, we do want to be protected in a way and having those response plans set. So the key considerations to keep in mind when developing these contingency or response plans are the timing of activities, the supporting information and procedures, the responsible person or people, the role players, and then finally the escalation channels should the action itself be impacted. Okay, then we move on to the component where we look at the levels of these response plans, and that itself should also be defined by the organization. To ensure that the required information is available at the time, it's essential that we have some kind of consistency in defining these response plans. So it's key to ensure that there's a level of what is required to address the actions needed, but then also a level of how, as shown in this example of process mapping levels. It's then up to the organization to mature the process over time to achieve that level 5 regarding procedural components on how to address responses. And maybe for key and complex operations, it may be required to ensure that the level 5 procedural components is defined as part of that initial implementation, again, depending on the need of the business. So ultimately, what do we end up with? We end up with this bird's eye view of the organization, having highlighted areas that highlights the points of failure, the impact levels, etc. That's then supported by the multiple business response plans to minimize the impact of the organization, while also in the meantime addressing these areas within the risk management framework. Again, as mentioned previously, it's not possible to mitigate and prevent all threats from happening. However, having these contingency or response plans provides us with these documented responses that includes key concepts that people will need in the event of disruptions. So the key things maybe in these response plans and the benefit that it brings to the table is, first of all, by defining it, it defines the triggers, the identification of how these events occur. And by doing this, there's this possible enhancement that can be addressed to change and adapt processes to minimize those possible triggers. Then also by identifying the people throughout the process of response embeds that ownership component. And then also adding the timing component to it will streamline the response. If people know they have X amount of time on specific actions, will ultimately enable a streamlined approach. Then also having the supporting documentation and procedures, and by defining those beforehand, increases the knowledge management principle, but also gives the individual time to develop these documents prior to the need of it within events. Then having those key role players defined enables the elimination of assumptions, thinking sometimes that individuals can assist or provide information. By going through the process prior to an event, we can eliminate those assumptions and then also enable that holistic or integrated approach with these multiple subject individuals as part of it. Then also implementing the escalation principles throughout the contingency plan, and then adding two key components. The first one being a management notification trigger, where we can enhance the incident management principle within the business, but then also building triggers for stakeholder communication, therefore enabling that protection of our organization's reputation. Okay. So again, as a summary, the key three components of that. So in closing, from a business resilience perspective, I think the ultimate benefits of an effective operational program is then, first of all, this business resilience. So that the point of failure framework ensures that we continuously track the vulnerabilities within an organization and then maybe possibly manage them to non-threatening levels, thus resulting in a direct improvement of our product or service availability and ultimately our customer satisfaction. I think the second key benefit of the operational resilience program is that the framework ensures that our risk control expenditure is directed at eliminating points of failures and properly allocating and prioritizing. And identifying these points of failures through the framework and proactively taking steps to manage them means that the organization can deploy its capital and its retained earnings in an optimal manner and in a way boost quality and service delivery and ultimately avoid those costly unplanned expenditures that we face associated with point of failure induced downtime. And then the final component is that the downstream benefit of proactively managing points of failures is that it provides a level of assurance to our stakeholders that the organization has a methodology to identify events, possible events, and manage these events in such a way that it minimizes the impact to our stakeholders as far as possible. Okay, so we do have a bit of time that we can spend on addressing some of the questions. So as I've gone through the presentation, some questions did come through, and I also do encourage you to send some questions. So maybe just to note that in the question or comment component, there is an individual stating that they do have some sound issues or had some sound issues. So again, maybe on any of the technical issues to contact the BCI directly. But then let's see. So the first question that came through, it states that is there a formal standard specifically for operational resilience? So I think, to my knowledge, there's not a formal standard specifically pertaining to operational resilience on its own. However, what we do see organizations use is that standard that I referred to initially, the British standard, the BS 65000. That is an organizational resilience standard, but it ultimately touches on key points for operational resilience itself. But then a lot of organizations then also use the ISO 22316 organizational resilience standards that provides that principle and attributes, but then also the guidelines on implementation. And I think, as we've discussed throughout the presentation, the key subset of that then is operational resilience. So in my view, those are two good standards to align to, and then add or align your program to. Then a second question here is asking that, is operational resilience something new that organizations are implementing? So I won't say it is something new that organizations are implementing. I think the way that organizations function and that they work, that each and every one of us in a way practice operational resilience on a day-to-day basis. But I think what is key is to say that the process itself and the program itself is maybe not formalized. In that way, therefore, having a documented approach, a documented framework to it with defined analysis results, defined dashboards pertaining to tracking it, defined response documentation that can be tested. So I think the overall formalization is maybe something new that we do see. I think what's key to it is sometimes it can be seen and should be seen as part of knowledge management, to make sure that that knowledge, skill, experience that people do have in organizations is documented, and then that information can be shared throughout the organization. So to summarize, I don't think it's something new. I think it's something that's practiced, but the formalization of it is definitely picking up. Then we have a third question stating here, asking is, what industries are more focused on operational resilience? So I don't think that operational resilience is an industry-specific requirement. I think operational resilience is essential and key and relevant to each and every organization. But I must say that we do see a bit more traction, if you like, in industries like the financial services or the banking industry, or even the telecoms. So I think where timing is quite key, and downtime is quite expensive, maybe that there may be a bit more traction to ensure that, yes, having business continuity, yes, having risk management, but then being prepared for those operational disruptions that people or companies may face. Okay. A fourth question that we have here is, where does the benefit feature most? Is it a management benefit or an operational benefit? So maybe to answer that, I think the benefit of an effective operational program is definitely on both sides, from a management perspective, but then also from an operational perspective. I think from a management perspective, having that ability to have this holistic view, this bird's eye view with defined vulnerabilities linked to it, you can even enhance that to have some dashboard or tracking mechanism. And I think then it comes back to those ideas that, it's difficult to manage something which you can't measure. So from a management perspective, is definitely that level of assurance and that overall holistic view that is an essential and key benefit of operational resilience framework. But then I think at an operational level, the benefit there is that these individuals are faced with these events, these operational events from time to time, and having these defined, documented guidance sometimes to handle these events, how to escalate, how quickly to do it, how, what, where, just makes the management of those events a lot easier. And it's usually these individuals that leave the office quite late in managing these events. So a definite benefit on both sides, on a management, but then also on an operational level. We see that. Then let's see. There's another question where individual says it's where do we draw the line? It's not necessarily possible to identify all threats within an organization and all risks. So I do fully agree with that. As stated, it's definitely not possible to do this. But I think by implementing a formal operational resilience framework builds a different type of culture to manage operational events. I think even going through the motions of the implementation, identifying looking at impacts, seeing what's required to build an effective response will all aid individuals in handling an event that is maybe not defined as yet. And then that this process is a living program like any other program within BCM or within risk management that constantly should be reviewed and updated and monitored, and over time it can maybe mature to a specific level where we do highlight the most probable events that we can possibly face. So I think yes, definitely not possible to identify all threats, but then still possible to build this culture of operational resilience that is then definitely needed. Okay, let's see if there's another question. So the question asks, who is normally responsible for operational resilience and who owns it within an organization? So what we've been seeing is that the best fit usually sits with a risk management principle or a business continuity management principle. I think the main reason behind it is that it links well with both subjects. So even the framework example that we went through today, you notice that it picks up on quite key components within a business impact analysis or key components within a risk assessment. So maybe aligning to these subjects, you can by adding a couple of questions as part of the normal BCM program or risk management program, you can definitely advance your operational resilience framework. So that's normally where the facilitation of the subject sits with risk or with BCM. But definitely overall the responsibility then obviously sits with management, being the custodians of the subject and taking that overall program responsibility. Then let's see, we have another question here asking how often to conduct these assessments and the best way to validate it. So the assessments, I think, again, like risk management or business continuity management, I think the initial implementation takes a bit of an effort to ensure that the full analysis is done. And then I think on an annual basis, or maybe when there is the significant structures of functions or roles or responsibilities within the organization, it's needed to review and update. But I think the more time that it's spent on maybe a monthly review quickly as part of a team meeting will definitely help this process. It's a bit more closer to the day-to-day activities of operations, being operational resilience, than that of risk or BCM. And then linking to the second part of the question where it asks the validation component. Again, I would align to principles of maturing in validating responses. I think by starting off taking these response plans and conducting like a desktop or walkthrough scenario to see how individuals, are they familiar with activities, how it interacts, what their roles and responsibilities are, and then advancing that to a simulation type of scenario, and later on maybe live or full tests. And the more people again spend time on these responses or validations, I think the better chance of success it will have. We have another question asking, is there software available for operational resilience? So to my knowledge, you obviously have lots of risk management software. You also have lots of business continuity management software. Specifically on operational resilience, the software that I've seen is more on simulation or modeling of operations, physically modeling the operational flows within processes, so that uh, a change in that modeling or simulation, you can easily see the effect and plan the response around it. And those are more, I think, for detailed technical procedures, or even in the manufacturing industries, they use those kinds of softwares. But I think what software packages. But what I think what's possible for organizations is, if they do have existing risk management or BCM software that they currently use, and if there is some form of customization available to those applications, it is, I think, easily enough to add the added dimension of operational resilience to those, and have a combined one, so that we don't have separate software packages and systems to address something that works hand in hand as subject matters. Okay, and then let's see, there's another question asking about the presentation itself, if we could share that. So I think all presentations and even the audio recording of the presentation can be downloaded from the BCI, I'm sure. Otherwise, I will obviously, let's see, provide my contact details, my email address. So I'm happy to obviously have a discussion and provide the slides to individuals afterwards. Let's see if there's any other questions. So let me just scroll through again. So there's another individual asking how to download the presentation. So again, I think through the BCI. However, the email address that you see here, you're welcome to send me an email, and then I can share the presentation with you directly and have a conversation if you like. There's another question stating that, bearing in mind the complexity of organizations and their processes, how do you effectively and efficiently document these processes and then manage change to them over time so that they remain accurate and useful? So that's a very valid question. I think we do see these. So in the one hand, if we have an organization that have nicely defined business as usual processes that they then obviously practice and follow, it makes it a lot easier to use those as a starting point to see where those threats are. And in some scenarios, what we try and do is build in those business as usual processes enough redundancy, so it's almost like a two-in-one to address that contingency or response component. The challenge is always to ensure that it stays relevant. So in some scenarios, we even encourage organizations to have like a site or some location where individuals can allocate topics of discussion. So maybe events that they were faced with and it wasn't covered as part of organizational program yet, or maybe something that they saw, it didn't result into a major event, but it easily could have. So that this is a more a day-to-day, a more living component, and that's the one way of ensuring that it stays alive and relevant. If organizations see it as a once-off exercise to sit and document these things, I don't think that they'll get the benefit out of it to the extent that they should. What we do see with organizations really practicing this is that they constantly change, they constantly brainstorm, they're using it in a way to enhance processes, enhance things on the manner or the way that they do things. So you need to make it part of your day-to-day to ensure that it remains accurate and useful. Otherwise, it can be a bit of an issue. So there's another question, I think, linking a little bit to a earlier question we had, saying which team or department should conduct or create these resiliency plans or methodologies. So I think, as I've mentioned, I think the best owners of it is usually risk. It's usually BCM, and then the custodians being management. But I think what's key to highlight is that risk or BCM should facilitate the process, but that it should be owned by business, because this is operational resilience. So it is a business process itself. So what we normally do is we work hand in hand with the business functions, and we develop that methodology with them. And once defined, that's something that's then applied within the organization. But that the results and the response plans and the vulnerabilities should be tracked through a central point, but then owned throughout the organization. And that makes the chance of success so much more. Again, another question, what trade sectors do we see mostly implement this framework, these types of operational frameworks? So again, as I stated, the more traction we've seen is more on the banking side, the financial sector, and then definitely the telecoms market do focus on the operational resilience components quite a bit. So then, is business impact analysis and operational resilience different? So again, maybe if we look at the slide again, you do see key components of a business impact analysis, and I think and you do see key components of a risk assessment. It's adding a couple of additional questions to get more detail on those, and then looking at the redundancy and the contingency of it. So I don't see it as something different. I see it as something, an added dimension, if you like, to a normal BIA or normal risk assessment, to cover components to enhance the operational resilience framework. Then there's another question asking, is there a formal framework that can be used as reference for the implementation? So again, no formal standard for operational resilience itself. Again, you can refer to that ISO or the BS standard. The framework itself is based on those 4 key steps, but then it is adding the unique detail in that aligns to the requirements of the business itself. Another question. What are the best points to score on to assure executive buy-in and support from leadership in implementing operational resilience? So what we've seen is that usually in organizations that have had some impacts in the past, or even organizations that have, I want to say, some near misses in the past, it's usually sometimes a little bit easier for those management teams to see the benefit of it. But I think the key points is that it provides that way to prioritize resources, a way to prioritize expenditure, a way to prioritize time spent, so that if you know where these vulnerabilities are, that you can direct it in that way. So in a way, it can almost be seen as a cost-saving initiative, which is always a good key point to start with in identifying the benefits of it. But I think ultimately, it is something, it just makes good business sense having a key operational framework within the organization, and maybe highlighting those key points that's happened in your organization specifically may make the process a bit easier in selling it at a high level. Then we have another question saying, in the functional analysis framework, how do you map the processes when the processes are conducted by various business units? How do you map the owners when the ownership passes through multiple areas? So what we do in that instance is, when we do that holistic framework, we don't necessarily align it to the organizational structure within the business. You can align it to key components or functions, and that a specific area may have a responsibility pertaining to a function versus the same function, another area having a different responsibility with the same role. So how we handle it is we assess and we put it under one umbrella, although it's difficult or different teams allocated to the same responsibility. But then when we assess it from that viewpoint. So we assess what the impact would be on those specific teams related to their responsibilities, and ensuring that they do have then a response to address it. So for one event, multiple teams are linked to it with multiple responsibilities, running in conjunction with different timing, different roles, different supporting information, and that's how we get that streamlined view. So yes, over a value chain, you do have multiple teams touching on multiple key points, but at an analysis perspective, we do it from that specific viewpoint in time. Okay. Then it looks like it's all the questions that came through as part of the presentation. I think I'm going to leave it as such. So as I've mentioned, my contact details is represented, it shows on the screen. So really, please feel free to send through your questions or even a discussion that you may want to have. I think I want to end off just to say thank you for the participation and thank you for the great questions. And I hope you enjoyed the presentation, and please enjoy the rest of this BCI and BCM Awareness Week. Thank you so much.